Jojo's one of my favorite manga of all time, and Part 7 is literally my favorite manga ever. So, it's fair to say I like the series quite a bit. But Part 1 is usually considered significantly lower quality than the entire rest of the series by non-fans and also fans, and is kind of the reason why a lot of people end up dropping the series. So, I want to go over why that is, why it's considered worse than all the other parts, but also what it does right. I think the best place to start when talking about why people don't like part 1 of JoJo is the protagonist, Jonathan, who is. Well, there's not really much to say about him. He's pretty boring. His personality is. I don't know. He's a good person, and that's about it. Which, when you have an entire series based around that one character, that's usually not a good sign when you can pretty much describe their entire personality in about 20 seconds. But what I don't think people acknowledge too much is that Jonathan is greatly enhanced because of Dio, the main villain of the series, who you probably have heard of before, even if you don't watch or read JoJo. And Dio isn't like a super complex character. He would get a little more complex in part 3 and especially part 6, but in part 1 he's pretty generic evil, but that's not a bad thing because he's he's so evil that it just loops around and becomes a great character. Like everything he does, like I don't know, he just goes beyond being just a generic evil character. If that makes any sense. Like the way he forces Jonathan to try and stop him, and the way he like I don't know, he's just so clearly does not care about anything, and I think that's a lot better than a lot of villains that authors try to make them like sympathetic or whatever, but they just end up being kind of boring. And I mean, I think Dio, he's just so evil. He's one of the most evil villains you'll ever see, and I think that really enhances him and makes Jonathan a lot more interesting because you have to see how he adapts to what Dio does, and it doesn't improve Jonathan as a character because he's still just reacting to whatever Dio does. But I think that without Dio, yeah, part 1 would not be great. So I think Dio is definitely the best part of part 1, and the way it sets up everything he does in the future is also great. Next thing to talk about when discussing part 1 is the side characters, and yeah, there's not much there. Speedwing became kind of a huge meme just because of how unintentionally funny he really is at a lot of points, but he's definitely an enjoyable character, but again, he's not super deep, and pretty much all the other characters are even less interesting than him. Will could have been interesting, but he just kind of dies before he really does much of any importance. And he teaches Jonathan Haman, and that's definitely important to the rest of the series, but yeah, as a character, he's just not that enjoyable. Jonathan's dad, uh, George, I even forgot his name there. He's so forgettable. I mean, he's just nice, and then Dio kills him, which I don't know. I think he really should have seen coming, but whatever. We'll ignore that for now. And I mean, that really does it for side character. Oh well, there is Erina, but I don't know. I think calling her a character is being a bit too generous there. So we're gonna move on from that to setting of part 1 is, well, I mean, in terms of anime overall and manga, it's fairly unique. I mean, 1800s Europe. That's not really. I mean, you don't really see that setting used a ton. So I think just for being unique, it gets some points. But I mean, when you compare it to the rest of JoJo overall, yeah, it's not even close to the most interesting. I think seeing like the old ancient castles and stuff, that was definitely the best part of part 1 setting. Like, I don't know, seeing just ruined castles and how Dio uses them and how Jonathan has to like traverse them. That's probably most interesting part, and I say that like it's a huge part of the series, really. It's usually just a background element, it's not that important, but when a series is as short as part 1 is, the setting, you can't really spend a super long time setting it up. Like, you can't make a world as detailed as One Piece in, how long is part 1? Like, what, 4 or 5 volumes? Yeah, you can't. 9 episodes, you can't really make a super complex setting or make it that interesting in that amount of time, so I'm willing to give it a pass on that. Next up is the battles, and I mean, they're definitely interesting. For the time, they were quite good, I'd say. I'd say only really, because Jojo started publication in the 80s, so at that time, I'd say only really Dragon Ball could compete with it in terms of battles. And I would say early Dragon Ball. I would say early Dragon Ball has better fights than Jojo Part 1. But second best battles is, that's not a very bad, placement, but it's when you compare it to future Jojo parts and just other more recent manga in general is where it really starts to fall apart. I mean, like, the villains they fight, Tarkus, Bruford, I mean, they're pretty cool. I mean, they're not super complex characters, but they are pretty cool. I don't know. And yeah, I mean, the strategies used, like, there is actual strategy. Again, I have to preface this in, like, the time it was made. Like, I like Fist of the North Star, but, I mean, Kenshiro pretty much just, you know, he just destroys people. There's not really much strategy. It's just who is stronger instantly wins. But in JoJo, there is some strategy. It's really basic compared to what we have now, but I think you really have to look at it from the time it was published in. And in that context, I think it was really well done. But that does lead into a major problem with the series, which is Hamon. And I think it could have been done well, which we actually do see in part 2, but that's getting too far ahead of myself here. That's the next video. I think that Hamon is, like, I don't know, in the way it's used in part 1, it just kind of, like, it just kind of, it's just a plot convenience, right? Like, the best example is definitely when they're trying to escape from one of the zombies, and they just use Hamon to gather a bunch of leaves, use it as a glider. Like, it was never, if it was explained that Hamon could, like, gather objects together, then sure, that would be fine. But it wasn't, so it just feels like complete convenience, and it just feels really cheap, which I do think is probably because the way manga is published. Like, Araki has gone on record saying he only really has a general idea of how he wants the part to begin and how he wants it to end, and everything in between just kind of comes up with as he goes, which, I mean, that's really impressive, but also it does lead to situations like this, where he just kind of traps his characters in unwinnable situations and has to pull out a convenience to save them, which is only really a huge problem in part 1. I'd say I don't really think he ever uses that again. Part 1 is really only where it's a major problem. End of part 8, maybe, but okay, that's way ahead of where we are right now. So overall, I think Hamon is by part 2. Because in part 2, we have everything established, and it never goes, like... In part 2, it's just handled a lot better. Like, we know the rules of Hamon, and that's how it's used, right? It never has any conveniences with it. So I think when it comes to part 2, which I'll get to whenever I make a video on that, I think Hamon it can be a good system, as we see in part 2. But in part 1, it's a very mediocre power system, so that's definitely a negative for part 1, I'd say. Before I get to the final part of this video, I just want to bring up the anime's changes. So the anime adds in some, or no, it doesn't add in, it takes out some scenes. Like, for instance, when Jonathan, I don't know, like, he gets sent to his room, doesn't get to eat dinner, and Danny's backstory is pretty much entirely cut. These aren't, like, super huge changes or removals, But when a character is as bare bones as Jonathan, pretty much anything like that is a really major addition, and I think it's really disappointing that they took them out. I really think they should have left those scenes in. Um, Now we get to the ending of part 1, which I think is far and away the best part of the series. So I haven't really been summarizing the plot, because that's not really how I'm making these videos right now, but basically, after probably the best fight in the series, I mean, it's nothing super amazing, I'm not going to go over it in detail, where Jonathan thinks he beats Dio, but it turns out he's actually not defeated, and we skip forward about half a year, I think. I don't know, it could have just been a few months, I forget. But basically, Jonathan is on the boat with Erina, and Dio just kills him, and that's how the part ends. Like, obviously, it's leading into part 2, and I believe part 3 was already somewhat planned by this point. But I think just the way it ended is really good. Like, this is why Jonathan, I overall don't like him very much, but I think this is the best showing of his character, really, where he's, like, I think if, Joseph was in this situation, it would not be nearly as, good as it is here, because Jonathan just understands the situation, and he doesn't try to get out of it, and he just tries to take Dio down with him. It's a really good scene. I think that, and especially with the context of part 3, it becomes even better because you know what actually happened. Yeah, I think the ending is just such an improvement for part 1, and you got to consider the context of the time it came out in. Like, I mean, even just killing off your main character is really a big deal. I mean, even today that would be a huge thing, especially for a shonen manga. But then replacing him, that's really that was really creative for Rocky at the time, and I think it really improved the series. I think that was like a genius decision, and I mean, it's why Jojo is one of my favorite manga of all time. And that's also just how I look at part 1. Like, I know this video has been pretty much entirely negative towards part 1, but I do overall like it. I think it's fun, but where it really gets interesting, or where I really start to enjoy it, is when you realize how important it was for the entire rest of the series. Like, I mean, parts 2, 3, arguably 4 wasn't really that connected to part 1, but 2, 3, 5, and 6, like, those are all, without part 1, those parts could have absolutely not happened. Just including part 4, when you're just talking about how it led to its creation. I just meant in the context of the story, like, part 4 probably could have happened without, part 1, with some changes. But anyways, what I'm trying to say is, like, how important it was for the rest of the series, and how much it set up. Like, it's really interesting, and, like, part 6 is a complete end to the series. I think if it just started on part 3, something like that, it wouldn't have been nearly as good. Like, if part 1 wasn't explored and part 3 just started, it's like, oh, Dio was alive a long time ago, now he's back. Wouldn't be as impactful because we don't know who Dio was, really. Which is also why I think you really shouldn't skip parts, but whatever, that's another discussion for another video. Even parts 7 and 8, like, part 7 is, it is completely disconnected, like, it's an alternate universe, but it's like an expansion, it's like a reimagining of how part 1 was, and how Rocky would make it if he did it with all the knowledge he had at the time he finished part 6, and we never would have gotten part 7 without part 1, so I think it's just like how important it is to Jojo, and even just manga in general. I think we have to look at it like that for how good it is, but just looking at it as a as a complete story on its own, it's enjoyable, but it's not anything great. So anyways, that's how I feel about part 1 of Jojo, and why I think people generally don't like it or talk about it nearly as much as the rest of the series. And I'll be covering part 2 sometime, well, sometime, you know, it could be tomorrow, it could be 2 weeks from now, who knows. Anyways, bye.